Robin Flynn filling in for Elias today. Montreal used to be known as Canada's Sin City. In the early to mid 20th century, the city even had its own red light district, which was centered on Saint Laurent and St. Catherine. It was a pulsing hub of cabarets, gambling dens, brothels even, fueled in part by Americans who were fleeing Prohibition, looking to have a good time. Jazz legends like Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong used to come to Montreal to perform on the regular. And even as recently as 20 years ago or so, Montreal was a premier destination for bachelorette parties. It was known as the place you want to be if you want to go out for a debaucherous night on the town. But that reputation seems to have shifted in recent years. So what exactly happened to our Sin City? Joining us now is Jenn Clamen, Mobilization and Communications Coordinator of Stella, an advocacy, health services, and support organization for sex workers in Montreal. Hi, Jen. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Now, I mentioned that, Montreal had its own red light district back in the day, complete with brothels and everything. How popular was that part of town? And, that reputation still sort of exists for that area with an older crowd, shall we say?
Yeah, I would say that, the area was obviously quite popular. People still talk about Montreal's red light. A lot of people have written about Montreal's red light. And while the very visible red light has been gentrified, destroyed, and people have been forcibly removed, the industry itself, the sex industry, still exists as much as it did back then. So do brothels in their more current form. But we just don't see it as much because people were forcibly displaced, and a lot of the strip clubs, as you mentioned, were shut down.
Yeah, I'm thinking about even 3 years ago, that big Club Super Sex sign was taken down. All this imagery has shifted in recent years.
Absolutely.
Why do you think that happened?
It happened actually across the country. It wasn't just specific to Montreal, and I would argue that Montreal hasn't necessarily lost its appeal as a sin city. It's just not as visible. People still come to do their bachelor parties and visit sex workers all the time and still visit the strip clubs. But that happened a lot because the sex industry changed shape as well and moved online or indoors. But it also happened, obviously, as a result of cities attempting to appease or appeal to a more conservative crowd, or to sort of hide in a typical hypocritical way the nightlife of the city that actually provides economic sustainability sometimes to cities like the sex industry does.
Right. Obviously, we still have sex workers, and you mentioned brothels. I didn't know Montreal still had brothels.
They're not called brothels, but brothels are just places that people work indoors, and people work indoors for the most part in the sex industry, yeah.
What has this meant for the safety of sex workers, sort of taking this out of the public view and moving it sort of online and indoors?
Yeah, it's a great question. Sometimes that invisibility or that isolation is preferred because sex and sexual services are a private matter, but forced isolation is different to chosen isolation. And so forced isolation or forced displacement, which is what happens to people working in city spaces or visibly in city spaces or businesses in city spaces, is always a dangerous thing, because it means that people who are forced to be in isolation or invisible often don't or are not able to actually get access to what is visible, like supports and whatnot. And so that forced invisibility is actually quite dangerous for people working in the sex industry, and people take advantage of that because they know that that people have been forced to be invisible, meaning that they won't be able to get access to help if they need it. So the option would be to give people that option to access supports or access visibility when they want it, but in a case of forced displacement, that's not always the case.
It's difficult to have these conversations because whenever we talk about the safety of sex workers, inevitably we start getting text messages at the radio station saying, well, if they want to be safe, don't be a sex worker.
Sure.
But the reality is it's the oldest profession in the world for a reason. There's demand, right? So making it safe is beneficial to everybody, I would think.
Of course. It's like saying to people, if you don't want to get pregnant, don't have sex. Or if you don't, it's not, people want to do things in the context, if they want to be able to choose and have autonomy and and have consent in the way that the conditions in which they're doing things. And so we don't say, oh, people get divorced, so we should abolish marriage. We say, if people have working conditions in the sex industry that aren't safe, then we should be making them safer. And we say that for other industries as well, agricultural industries, where people are forced to work 12 hours a day or even longer, instead of regular hours that labor movements have fought for. We don't say abolish the agricultural industry. And so sex work in and of itself isn't dangerous. Sex for money isn't dangerous in and of itself. It's the conditions in which sex workers are forced to work, whether it's forced isolation or otherwise, that are dangerous. So obviously, saying just people shouldn't do it because it's dangerous isn't obviously going to deter people from making money or trying to make money and trying to sustain context of capitalism. So
yeah, and I think society as a whole has an issue with women having agency over their own bodies and choosing.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, choosing what we do, and making money even is still a relatively novel concept for women.
I know.
So this used to be one of the only ways that women could earn money.
Well, and it's not degrading for every woman who decides to do it. And obviously the conditions in which some women choose to sell sex is not ideal conditions. First and foremost, because it's a criminalized industry, and so the earnings are criminalized in different ways. And so it's not a happy choice all the time, but it's about making things safer for people. And people make decisions in the context in which they live. For some people, it's about stealing a loaf of bread or selling sex. And for selling sex, it's not actually degrading in the way that other women might find it degrading. So people need to recognize that people make decisions all the time, even if those decisions are not ones that you would make.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the stealing a loaf of bread. I've seen many times online people saying, if you see a mom stealing a can of formula, no, you didn't. People have to do what they have to do to get by, right?
That's right. And so there's people in the sex industry that are selling sex for those reasons. There are people in the sex industry who are selling sex to pay for school, to pay for children, all sorts of reasons. And again, the forced displacement isn't particularly helpful, and is quite dangerous for people who want to be visible at different moments.
Why do you think, Jen, that there seems to be a societal acceptance, if you will, with sex workers who are strippers versus sex workers who sell sex for money? We seem to be cool with strip clubs, but once you actually start selling sex, no, that's where people draw the line.
Yeah, well, and they don't really draw the line. They just might draw the line publicly. The hypocrisy in every city, particularly Montreal, is quite rich and deep. And a lot of people who work in strip clubs also sell sex outside of the strip clubs. And so people work across the industry in different ways. But for sure, there's different levels of acceptance that are more socially acceptable, like strip clubs. But there's a hierarchy within the sex industry with respect to the public. The public has a hierarchy of what is acceptable in the same way they have a hierarchy around everything. And that's part of the problem, is they don't recognize the context in which the work is happening, and it's work all across the board. But for sure, the visibility of the sex industry has at different moments offended people to different levels, and that's part of the reason why we don't see strip clubs anymore. But the industry moves into different spaces in different ways. And there still are strip clubs in Montreal that are thriving.
Yep, exactly. Jenn Clamen, Mobilization and Communications Coordinator at Stella, an advocacy, health services, and support organization for sex workers in Montreal. Thank you so much for this, Jen. It was a really, really great discussion.
Thank you so much for inviting me.